Welcome back to the second of our Fireside Chats. And let me just check, sorry. This time I am delighted to welcome Yoav Schlesinger. He is the Principal Ethical AI Practice He is the Principal of Ethical AI Practice at Salesforce, and I'm really looking forward to talking to him today. So hold on, let me see if we can get him on the screen. Yoav, are you there? It worked.
Hello.
Hi, welcome.
Thank
We
you.
got some questions for you today. And we had a good chat beforehand about a few topics that I think we've got lots of shared interest in. So if I can begin, so ethics is now coming to the forefront of corporate tech development. What's Salesforce's approach to this?
Yeah, it's a great question. We, like many Silicon Valley actors, have sort of awakened to the notion that ethics needs to be a part and parcel of everything we do at Salesforce. We are, just for context, a data processor, right? We are a platform and empower our customers to do things like power their sales or provide customer service, et cetera. And they store data on our platform and deploy it to serve their customers, their end users, if you will. So at Salesforce, we have 4 core values that kind of influence and inform how we approach ethics and AI specifically. Trust, customer success, innovation, and equality. And when it comes to ethical AI, we really lean in on trust and equality, obviously. Those formulate and serve as the substrate and basis for a lot of conversations about how do we approach a particular topic. We have a method for strategic planning or annual plans called a V2MOM. Values, vision, methods, obstacles, and measures. And everyone in that process has a trust measure or method. It's an integrated and integral part of how we think about the process of building tech in the first place. So we approach it from that place, and I actually sit in our tech and product organization. So our ethical AI practice doesn't sit in legal or policy or communications. We sit in the tech organization so that we can work directly with teams to think about the consequences of the products they're building and to embed ethics all along in the agile process so that they're driving toward more ethical outcomes for our customers and, like I said, their end users. So kind of have a 3-pronged approach, I guess, to doing that. The first is building training and awareness. So how do we give people on our tech teams what I like to call moral muscle memory, what a colleague of mine calls ethical spidey sense, to spot risks before they happen and to act on them. So whether that's through bespoke training on the particular products that they're building, or whether that's generalized ethical training and awareness when employees are onboarded, we try to inculcate a culture where there is that moral muscle memory. The second pillar of that work is risk assessment, right? So taking our products and running them through exercises that enable us to spot those risks. And then the last is what I would call feature development, right? So how do we build concretely into our products features that help our customers do the right thing, or that insert positive or useful friction into the process so that they're making choices that are well-informed and thoughtful. And all of that is what we call ethics by design. It's the process by which, teams, whether they're engaged in roadmap planning or sprint reviews or some other exercise, are asking how will ethics show up in this product? And that's kind of our approach. So it's guided a little bit by values, a little bit by our overall approach and awareness building, and then lastly by some concrete process that is embedded so that teams are touching ethics all along the way.
And with this, I mean, it sounds like you're really building it and baking it into the whole design process. But what do you see as your main challenge in doing this? Are there obstacles to doing this?
Yeah, I wish, I guess, that it were limited to a single challenge. Instead, I will speak a little bit about the challenges because they're definitely in the plural. So I would say the first is that, this is unsettled territory. Even in academia, these questions have not yet found answers, if you will, right? So how one measures fairness in an algorithm is not settled territory. And so we are having to answer that question for ourselves in the context of industry and a tech company, separate from academia. And we certainly are informed by what is happening in academia in that respect, but there's no answers, if you will. Secondly, I would say we are building the boat as we're sailing it. There are no best practices for any of this yet. People are starting to build it, but we're kind of like the security industry was 25, 30 years ago, where there were nascent efforts thinking about security reviews before launching products, but nobody had really established it as firm process yet. So I think we're still kind of in that nascent phase. For us particularly at Salesforce, we have then I think 2 or 3 other specific challenges to us. The first is that, as I mentioned, we're a data processor, so we don't own our data, which means that we don't control every model that we deploy. We have some of our own AI models that are deployed to all of our customers, but then each customer can customize our product and deploy their own algorithms and models themselves in the context, in the specific context that they need it. And so we don't control how they use that data. We can provide guidance, we can provide best practices to them, but ultimately the decisions are theirs. And so sitting in a place of trying to think about ethics, it's a really interesting balancing act to try to pull off, right, where we are responsible to some degree for our own decision making and are in a position where we also want to empower our customers to make those same kind of ethical decisions. And so we can't be prescriptive about that. We can only be consultative, and that's a real challenge. So all of those make us, I would say, in terms of, you know, crawl, walk, run phase, we're kind of between crawl and walk, I would say.
I think there's a lot of us sitting in that space at the moment, definitely. And we've chatted beforehand about the need for an approach that's inclusive and that's centered on the people who are ultimately affected by the tech. And I wonder if you can tell us a little bit more on that and about how Salesforce approaches that.
Yeah. And then I'd love to hear if you have any thoughts on this as well. You know, we are, I think, at a point where it is critical, it is no longer optional to center the affected voices in the conversation about how this tech is built. And that can take many different forms. Obviously, critically important is who are the builders in the first place and who's in the room as the tech is getting built. But equally important is bringing in those voices from external expertise as well. So we at Salesforce try to consult affected communities, affected customers, their end users, et cetera. So as an example, you know, we recently deployed a product called work.com, which is a back to work, back to school solution in the context of the pandemic. You know, we learned a lot by speaking to people in meatpacking factories and warehouse workers and school districts. And by actually talking to the people who are going to be using and being impacted by the tech, that is really an important piece of building products that meet the needs of communities, not just individuals, right? So I like to think about this as a pivot from human-centered design in a way to society-centered design, right? If I ask my daughter who's 5 what she wants for breakfast, she's likely to say some sugary cereal, Fruit Loops in her case. It's not what's best for her, right? But that would be human-centered design. I would just figure out the best way to get her more Fruit Loops in any given morning if I were designing just for her. If I'm designing for what's actually best for her and for children generally, I probably wouldn't optimize my model for delivering Fruit Loops to children around the world. And so thinking about you know, taking that more globalized approach, that more society-centered approach, I actually think that helps to mitigate bias, even though we know it can't be eliminated, and thinking about centering those affected voices.
Does your daughter get a say though? I mean, is it a community where the community is heard?
Yes, once a week she is able to eat whatever she wants
Okay.
for breakfast.
So she has a voice in this as well. Okay.
She does.
And I like the approach. I think that there's definitely, and our speakers today have really flagged this up, that it is time that we had design-led AI that is centered on the people who will be affected by it. And I go a step further and say led by the people that are affected by it as well. We need to dismantle some of the old structures that are in place. So I think that this is, it's a very timely thing to be looking at, definitely, as earlier speakers have said. And I think this sort of moves nicely into an area where we both had a lot of common ground when we talked initially, which is education. So how are we going to teach? How are we going to influence or help the future generations about embedding ethics into tech?
So from the position of industry, I would say we need two things. We need expansive thinkers with technical expertise, and we need people who have technical expertise who have expansive thinking. And some degree, people like me who have interdisciplinary backgrounds who probably meet neither of those two things exactly. So, the first is relatively easy. Expansive thinkers with technical expertise. Philosophy students have always been able to go and take an introduction to programming class and learn the technical skills of building tech. Technical experts with expansive thinking has been more challenging territory, I think, for all of us, because the disciplines of computer science, of data science, et cetera, are relatively immature when it comes to thinking about how to embed or integrate that expansive thinking into the core work of building AI. So if you think about it, a lot of introductory programming exercises that you'll learn, don't do that thing we were just talking about centering people, right? So how do you build, if you are an instructor in an introductory computer science course, how do you build exercises that actually require your students to be thinking about a human aspect of that coding exercise in the first place? You and I, Kate, were talking a little bit about an exercise that I did as an undergraduate where I had to build a lemonade stand that would optimize pricing for a cup of lemonade based on weather and purchasing patterns and all that sort of thing. But nowhere in that exercise did it consider whether people could afford lemonade in the first place, or perhaps the consideration that on a very hot day, you shouldn't raise the price, but you should actually lower the price because there are people who might be thirsty and who might be at risk if they can't access, right? Hydration, I don't know. So thinking about building exercises, even at that early stage, that require students to be embedding and integrating and considering ethics at the outset so that it doesn't become an ancillary, secondary, separate enterprise of thinking about ethics, but that it's deeply embedded. And I think, again, we're at the crawl stage of figuring that out. Like, how do we actually integrate ethics? Because it's not a given how one does that. If you've got an introductory computer science course with 2,000 students, how do you grade and measure ethics and the consideration that 2,000 students have done about that exercise? But I think
it's definitely a challenge.
that's the challenge, right? I think that we're all facing. But that crossing that Rubicon is going to be necessary. If we don't figure that out, then we will not have the kind of expertise in industry that we need and the kinds of talent that we need in order to meet our collective goals of ethical and responsible and trusted AI.
Yeah, and I'm flying the flag definitely for interdisciplinary education. And I think we talked about the lemonade stand thing. And my thing is, what happens when someone comes along, a white woman comes along and phones the police because 2 black kids are selling lemonade? That's the kind of stuff that's not being factored into our algorithms today about social injustice and inequality. And we really need to be teaching that and about bad actors in the system as well. So I think that, I really like this idea about embedding it, not just for the people commenting from a sociological perspective, but embedding it into the technical education too. I think you're right, it's really key. We are out of time, I'm afraid. If you can just give me one last thing, which is, what are you most excited about in the future?
I am most excited about the pivot from principles and values conversations to governance and actually building tech. I think that we have tremendous opportunity at this point in our development around ethical AI to actually build products that meet people's needs. And that's exciting territory to put in teeth in terms of governance and process that will actually drive better outcomes at the end of the day.
Fantastic. Yeah, thank you very much for talking to me. And if anyone wants to continue this with questions and answers, there should be a link coming up to go now into a separate chat room to be able to talk about that. Thank you.
Great, thanks.